The story of Derek Sullivan begins not in a courtroom, but in a small suburban neighborhood outside Cincinnati. A jury would one day condemn him to life, without parole, for the murder of his girlfriend, Kayla Monroe. But the question that still echoes is, was he truly the only one responsible? To understand the weight of that verdict, we have to step back into the life Kayla presented to the world. At 22, she radiated charm that made her impossible to ignore. Friends described her as magnetic, the type of woman who could light up a room without trying. Derek, a 27-year-old mechanic with grease-stained hands and a steady reputation, believed he had found the woman who would anchor his future. Together, they seemed untouchable, a young couple balancing warmth and ambition, love and stability. Yet perfection has cracks. Kayla's late-night outings, unanswered calls, and vague explanations began to stir unease in Derek. Still, he brushed it aside, unwilling to believe his insecurities carried weight. In a city where gossip traveled faster than news, whispers about Kayla floated through coffee shops and crowded bars. Most men in Derek's position would demand answers. Derek chose silence, convincing himself she was simply busy, that her loyalty remained intact. But silence is fragile, and secrets have a way of breaking through. One careless conversation, one stranger's words, would soon pull Derek into a storm he could never escape. It was a Friday night in downtown Cincinnati when the first real fracture appeared. Derek stood among coworkers at a bar near Fountain Square, the kind of place where laughter drowned out worries and conversations blurred into background noise, until one stranger's casual remark cut through everything. The man, half drunk and telling stories, spoke Kayla's name without hesitation. He described a night that didn't fit the picture Derek carried in his head, a night she had never mentioned, one that raised more questions than it answered. Derek listened in silence, his stomach sinking as laughter filled the room around him. Back home, Derek replayed the words over and over. Why would a woman so committed to their future be tangled up in stories whispered by strangers? Why did her late-night study sessions never line up with what her friends posted online? And why, every time he confronted the feeling, did she disarm him with a smile that seemed impossible to doubt? In a city where everyone seemed to know everyone's business, Derek could no longer ignore the patterns. Cincinnati wasn't just talking, it was talking about her. Still, Derek said nothing. To friends, he appeared steady, loyal, devoted. Inside, he carried a weight he couldn't name. But this was only the beginning. The truth would not come in whispers. It would crash into him like a flood, leaving behind humiliation, anger, and questions he couldn't stop asking. And the most haunting of all, who else already knew? The bar was loud, but Derek could hear every word. The man speaking didn't know him, didn't know his connection to Kayla. And maybe that was the cruelest part. Her name was being tossed into casual conversation, stripped of privacy, stripped of loyalty. The story wasn't vague. It was detailed. Kayla, described vividly, was said to have been seen with men Derek knew. Not just acquaintances, people who had once eaten at his family table, men he had laughed with, trusted, even called brothers and everything but blood. Derek tried to dismiss it as drunken talk, yet the specifics gnawed at him. A description of her dress, a mention of a familiar car, details no outsider should have known. By the time the stranger finished, Derek wasn't just listening. He was unraveling inside. Humiliation hit harder than anger. If strangers at a bar knew about Kayla's double life, how many others had been laughing behind his back? How long had he been the fool in someone else's story? The drive home that night was silent, Derek gripping the steering wheel so tightly his hands ached. He didn't confront her immediately. Not yet. A part of him hoped he was wrong, that the stranger was mistaken. But hope can only stretch so far before it snaps. The answers he sought were coming, and Kayla herself would deliver them, with a calmness that felt colder than the betrayal itself. When Derek finally asked, Kayla didn't flinch. No hesitation, no frantic attempt to cover her tracks. Her eyes met his, steady, almost daring. "Yes," she said, "it's true. 6 men. Not 1, not 2. 6. Some of them close to Derek in ways that cut deeper than he could bear. A co-worker he trusted with overtime shifts. A childhood friend he had known since grade school. even a man who once stood proudly as a groomsman at his brother's wedding. Derek had expected denial, excuses, tears. Instead, Kayla spoke with a calmness that felt unnerving. There was no apology in her tone, only confirmation. She seemed detached, almost curious about how he might react. For Derek, the world shifted in that moment. Betrayal wasn't just personal, it was public. Every handshake, every laugh, every memory with those men now twisted into mockery. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He didn't throw accusations or demand explanations. Friends later said he appeared oddly calm in the days after her confession. To them, it looked like acceptance. To Derek, it was survival, holding himself together while his pride, his love, and his future lay in pieces. But calmness is deceptive. Inside, Derek was a man walking a cliff's edge, waiting for the ground to give way. And soon it would. After Kayla's confession, Derek's reaction stunned those around him. Friends expected rage, heartbreak, even public outbursts. Instead, he moved through the days as though nothing had changed. He went to work, chatted with neighbors, and even cracked a few jokes with co-workers. On the outside, he seemed steady, but inside, Derek was carrying a humiliation that words couldn't describe. Cincinnati wasn't a city where secrets stayed hidden for long. Every glance from a friend, every lingering silence in a conversation, left him wondering who knew. Did people see him as the mechanic devoted to his girlfriend, or as the man whose partner betrayed him with half a dozen others? Kayla, for her part, didn't back away. She went on with her life, unapologetic, as though daring Derek to either leave or accept the truth. The imbalance between her indifference and his quiet storm only deepened the tension. It was in those days that Derek's composure became unsettling. A man betrayed so deeply shouldn't have been so calm. And yet he was. Even Kayla reportedly told a friend she didn't believe Derek would ever leave her. His silence, in her mind, meant she was untouchable. But calmness is not always peace. Sometimes it's a mask, one that hides fractures ready to split wide open. The fractures would finally appear on a night that began like any other, in a quiet Cincinnati neighborhood where no one could have predicted the violence about to unfold. May evenings in Cincinnati often carried the hum of neighbors settling in, porch lights flickering on, the distant sound of traffic rolling down side streets. On one of those nights, Kayla's apartment became the stage for the confrontation everyone would later talk about. Neighbors recalled hearing her voice before midnight, sharp, clipped, frustrated. One woman living across the hall told detectives she thought Kayla was on the phone, her tone rising in waves of anger. Others remembered a car idling outside, headlights cutting briefly across the windows before vanishing down the street. Derek, meanwhile, wasn't home. Friends later testified they saw him driving aimlessly that night, his truck circling familiar roads without destination. To those who knew him, he looked lost, caught between fury and despair. But somewhere between the restless drive and Kayla's raised voice, paths crossed. What happened next would fracture everything. By morning, Kayla would be gone. Derek would be in custody, and Cincinnati would be left with more questions than answers. Yet one detail, small but significant, would haunt investigators for years. Neighbors swore they didn't just hear Kayla and Derek that night. There was another voice, a man's, one no one ever identified. The night was only beginning, but already it carried the weight of tragedy. Kayla's apartment was small, but that night it felt suffocating. Neighbors later said they heard the thud of footsteps, a door slamming, and voices raised high enough to carry through the thin walls. Derek's was one of them, sharp, controlled, but filled with a strain that couldn't be ignored. What caught their attention, though, wasn't Derek alone. Another man was there, his voice, deeper, unfamiliar, mixed with Kayla's and Derek's in the chaos. The argument grew heated, shifting from accusations to threats, then dipping into moments of eerie silence before flaring again. Inside, Derek was face to face with the woman he once planned to marry, now standing beside someone who didn't belong. The betrayal he'd swallowed for weeks was suddenly alive in front of him. Witnesses described Kayla's voice as defiant, unshaken, as though she held the upper hand in the conflict. Derek, however, sounded like a man torn apart, broken pride clashing with a desperation to regain control of a life slipping away. The details of what happened inside that apartment remain disputed. What was said, who struck first, and why it escalated so violently, those answers never came. But what's certain is this: by the time the shouting stopped, a silence fell so heavy that even the neighbors listening froze in place, waiting for what they feared might come next. It happened fast. A single gunshot ripped through the stillness of the night, echoing down the narrow hallway of Kayla's apartment building. The neighbors who had been listening rushed to their doors, hearts racing, unsure if they should open them or call for help. Inside, Kayla lay on the floor, her body motionless. The woman who once carried laughter into every room was suddenly gone in an instant of violence. Forensic reports would later show the shot was fired at close range, leaving no question about intent. Panic swept through the building. Calls to 911 poured in. Some neighbors swore they heard footsteps racing down the stairs, too quick and frantic to be Derek's alone. Others recalled the creak of the back door swinging shut before the sirens ever arrived. When police entered the scene minutes later, Derek was nowhere to be found. Kayla's apartment was chaotic, furniture shifted, belongings scattered, as if a struggle had torn through the space. And yet, one fact lingered. The man neighbors had described, the voice they were so certain belonged to someone else, had vanished without a trace. The tragedy was undeniable. Kayla was gone. The question was no longer if a crime had been committed, but who exactly had committed it. And that uncertainty would shadow every step of the investigation that followed. By sunrise, police had a suspect in mind: Derek Sullivan, the boyfriend, the man with the clearest motive, humiliated by betrayal and fueled by heartbreak. To investigators, it seemed straightforward. Kayla was dead, and Derek was the storm at her doorstep. He was found hours later at his brother's house, sitting quietly in the garage, not hiding, not running, just waiting. Officers described him as calm, his hands steady as they placed him in cuffs. No resistance, no denial, only exhaustion etched into his face. Inside the interrogation room, detectives pressed him for hours. They spoke of Kayla's lifeless body, of neighbors who heard shouting, of the life he'd lost in a matter of seconds. Derek didn't deny being at the apartment. He admitted they fought. But when it came to the gunshot, his words faltered. He swore another man had been there, someone who fled before police arrived. The problem? There was no evidence of anyone else. No fingerprints, no DNA, no camera footage. The case, at least on paper, looked simple. A betrayed boyfriend snapped. But the way Derek carried himself, the calmness, the repeated insistence that he wasn't alone, left an uncomfortable sliver of doubt. And that doubt only grew when neighbors stood by their claims. They had heard 2 male voices that night. As detectives built their case, one detail refused to disappear. Multiple neighbors swore they had heard another man inside Kayla's apartment during the argument. His voice was distinct, separate from Derek's. One woman even claimed she heard him slam a door before running down the stairwell. Yet when police combed the apartment, there was nothing. No footprints outside the back door, no fingerprints that didn't already belong there, no trace of a second suspect. The official report reduced the witness accounts to confusion during a stressful event. For Derek's defense, that mysterious voice became the cornerstone. His attorney argued that the state was ignoring evidence that pointed to another suspect, someone with equal or greater motive to silence Kayla. But without proof, the theory sounded more like speculation than fact. Still, the whisper spread. Who was the man? Why had he never been identified? And why did the investigation seem so eager to close the door on him? The trial was approaching, and prosecutors were confident. They didn't need an unnamed suspect. They had Derek, the boyfriend, the motive, and the rage. But unanswered questions don't vanish. They linger, pressing at the edges of truth, waiting for the moment they can no longer be ignored. And in this case, those questions would follow Derek into the courtroom, casting a shadow over everything the jury was about to hear. Months after Kayla's death, the case of State of Ohio versus Derek Sullivan was ready for the courtroom. For prosecutors, it was straightforward. A man betrayed by the woman he loved snapped in a fit of rage. For Derek's defense, it was a desperate fight to prove there was more to the story. The trial preparations exposed 2 very different portraits of Derek. The prosecution painted him as a man consumed by humiliation, incapable of handling Kayla's betrayal. They emphasized the closeness of her affairs. Men he knew, trusted, even considered family. Rage, they said, had pushed him over the edge. The defense countered with a quieter narrative. They argued Derek was broken, yes, but not violent. They highlighted his unusual calm in the days after her confession, portraying it as restraint, not calculation. Most importantly, they clung to the mystery man. Neighbors had been clear. A second voice was in that apartment. If Derek was guilty, they asked, then who fled the scene before police arrived? The jury, seated under the weight of the story, was asked to decide between rage and restraint, betrayal and mystery. But what neither side fully anticipated was how raw the testimony would become. When friends and family took the stand, Kayla's private life was dragged into the public eye, and with it came revelations that would leave even the jurors stunned. The courtroom became a theater of painful truths. Witness after witness recounted Kayla's charm, her social life, and her complicated relationships. Every detail of her affairs was laid bare, and the names attached to them cut deep into Derek's credibility. One co-worker admitted to being involved with Kayla, describing encounters that overlapped with her nights out. Derek's childhood friend, once like a brother, was forced to confirm the same. And when it came out that one of the men had stood as a groomsman at Derek's brother's wedding, the jury shifted uneasily in their seats. The prosecution leaned hard on these betrayals, painting Derek as a man humiliated in every corner of his life. They argued that no one could endure such public disgrace without snapping. For Derek, each testimony was a fresh wound. He sat at the defense table, silent, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the desk before him. To the jury, that silence could look like guilt, or it could look like the quiet of a man destroyed by truths too painful to relive. The defense cross-examined, pushing witnesses on timelines, on motives, on inconsistencies. Still, the image of Kayla's secret life was now burned into the trial. But just as it seemed the prosecution had sealed their narrative, whispers of the unnamed man resurfaced. And when that mystery was raised in front of the jury, the case shifted into even more dangerous territory. The defense seized their final chance to shift the jury's focus. They returned again and again to the neighbor's testimony. Multiple people swore they had heard another male voice inside Kayla's apartment that night. One woman was firm on the stand. She heard Derek, she heard Kayla, and she heard a third man. His voice was deeper, angrier, not like Derek's at all. Another neighbor described footsteps running down the stairwell after the gunshot. Their accounts were consistent, unwavering. Prosecutors countered with equal force. They argued that shock distorts memory, that in moments of fear people hear what they expect, not what is real. They reminded the jury that no evidence, no prints, no fibers, no witness who saw another man had ever been found. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Was Derek guilty beyond a doubt, or had investigators closed their eyes to a second suspect? The defense pressed that the state's version was incomplete. The prosecution insisted the second man was a phantom, a distraction invented to save Derek's life. By the time closing arguments ended, the jury was left with a heavy burden to decide whether the missing man was a ghost of memory or a real figure erased from the investigation. Their decision would change Derek's life forever. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Behind closed doors, they weighed betrayal, humiliation, and the haunting possibility of another man who slipped through the cracks. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. The foreman stood, hands trembling slightly, and delivered the words that sealed Derek Sullivan's fate. Guilty of murder in the first degree. Gasps rippled through the room. Kayla's family clutched each other, some sobbing, others stone-faced, as though justice had finally answered their grief. Derek didn't move. His face remained still, eyes fixed forward, expression unreadable. Some saw resignation in his silence, others defiance. To the jury, it looked like acceptance of the inevitable. The judge's voice was steady as he handed down the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. No second chance, no return to freedom. Derek would spend the rest of his life behind bars. For many, the verdict was satisfying. For others, it felt incomplete. The unanswered questions, the second voice, the man who may have fled, lingered like smoke after a fire. As Derek was led away in shackles, one truth became clear. Justice had spoken, but doubt had not been silenced. The courtroom lights dimmed, the crowds dispersed, and Cincinnati slowly returned to its daily rhythm. But for those who lived near Kayla's apartment, silence never returned in full. Her name was carried in whispers, retold in hushed voices, as though the walls of that home still remembered. For her family, justice was both a relief and a wound. The verdict closed one chapter, yet nothing could restore the daughter, the sister, the friend who had been lost. Birthdays passed with an empty chair. Holidays carried her absence like a shadow at the table. For Derek, life became measured in steel bars and the echo of footsteps in prison corridors. His name faded from headlines, but not from debate. Was he a man broken by betrayal, or a killer who acted with cold intent? And what of the mysterious voice some swore they heard? If another man was there that night, his truth was buried with the verdict. In the years that followed, the story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly love can shift to suspicion, and how betrayal, whether real or imagined, can ignite irreversible destruction. Even now, long after the sentence was delivered, the community still asks, how much do we truly know about the ones we trust most? And perhaps that is the heaviest weight of all, the knowledge that behind every closed door, there may lie secrets we will never fully uncover. If you found this video informative, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more deep dives into true crime cases. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay safe.